There was an anti-lynching movement had actually grown powerful in the South as well, addressing the widespread use of terror by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, and others. When it wasn't violence, there was a threat of violence. And the threat of violence itself is violence as well. And so they play leadership roles in helping persons navigate the threats that came from just talking back to a police officer. They call it talking back. As people talk about, children had to be taught how to survive encounters with white people of the time, because there was this unnatural authority the white folks had over African Americans, or like not looking at white folks in the eye, or saying yes sir or no sir, or yes ma'am, no ma'am. The people younger than you, being able to have to endure being called by your first name by a child, a white child, and such and things. So those were the things that people had to learn to navigate back in those days, while still maintaining your full self-respect and your full dignity. It was necessary to survive in order to live to fight another day, so to speak.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Stayed on Freedom podcast, a podcast of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. I am the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe, and I have served as the host of this podcast for the last couple of episodes, but today I am excited to welcome Brucey Porter, who is serving as my co-host and the interviewer of the hour. Brucey is a student at Auburn University. She's a doctoral candidate, but importantly for today, she is a civil rights research fellow of the consortium. And for the last 10 months, she has been doing some work in the field, working closely and listening intently to an extraordinary, ordinary community that is a part of the consortium, St. Paul United Methodist Church. Now, many of you may not know the story of St. Paul. St. Paul sits right next door to 16th Street Baptist Church. Many know the story of 16th Baptist Church, at least from September 15th, 1963. They know the story of the 4 little girls who were killed in the bombing of the church. But most do not know the story of what happened in the months that preceded that bombing. On April 7th, 1963, we found ourselves in the midst of what was called the Birmingham campaign. And St. Paul United Methodist Church played a critical role in that movement, and there was something that came to be known as the Palm Sunday March on April the 7th, 1963, where pastors, Dr. King's brother, A.D. King, and 2 others were arrested. The church, St. Paul, at that time was pastored by the Reverend Joseph Lowry. But that moment spoke to a continuation of a legacy of struggle that we find within communities, that we find amongst ordinary people, that we find in between the lines and beneath the headlines. And Brucey, as a part of her research, has a story to tell. So we look forward today to hearing her interview with one of the leaders of the present-day St. Paul United Methodist Church, Scott Douglas, and to hear about their story, about where they've been, about what they've gone through, about where they're going to. And so I'm excited to turn this episode of Stayed on Freedom to Brucey Porter, the Civil Rights Research Fellow of the Consortium, to hear more about the ordinary extraordinary, the extraordinary ordinary community of St. Paul United Methodist Church. Brucey, tell us about what it is that you were able to do in connecting with St. Paul.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It has been an honor to work with the people of St. Paul. And for over 150 years, the people of St. Paul have been nothing less than extraordinary. Established in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, St. Paul has transformed into a pivotal community for the advocacy of all people, from emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and into the present day. In the beginning of my role with the consortium, I was tasked with finding the early history of St. Paul. Now, while their role in the 1963 marches was well known, the people of St. Paul knew that their role as a leader in social justice started much before 1963.
Right.
And from my work, I uncovered that generations of changemakers molded St. Paul for the betterment of not just the Black community in Birmingham, but the Black community nationwide. In the face of racial violence, oppression, and displacement, St. Paul remained committed to Christ and called to change for the betterment of the community, not just in Birmingham, but across the nation. And I'm excited to be here today to talk with a member of that community, Mr. Scott Douglas.
Scott Douglas. So that legacy continues today.
Yes.
And so you interviewed Scott Douglas at his office at Greater Birmingham Ministries.
Yes.
So what did you talk with him about?
We started off really talking about the beginnings of St. Paul and how St. Paul is actually started 2 years before the formation of the city of Birmingham. So how St. Paul's formation as a church sort of coincided with the development of what became known as the Magic City, and how in the immediate aftermath of the establishment of Birmingham and of St. Paul as a church, we are immediately faced with the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of stringent Jim Crow laws.
Wow.
And how the people of the St. Paul's community really came together even after being displaced time and time again from all of their church sites, to form a safe space for the Black community in Birmingham.
Well, in this month of April, as we remember what happened on April 7th, 1963, we look forward to hearing more about what happened, what is happening, and what is to come at St. Paul United Methodist Church, led by our Civil Rights Research Fellow, Brucey Porter.
Welcome, Mr. Douglas, to the Stayed on Freedom podcast presented by the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk about St. Paul's United Methodist Church here in Birmingham, Alabama. So before we get started, I know that we are all familiar with St. Paul's role in the 1963 Children's Crusade movement, which we just celebrated an anniversary for, but I wanted to take us back all the way to the beginning to talk about the early days of St. Paul. Could you tell me a little bit about sort of the formation of the church?
Yes, Brucey. St. Paul was organized as a congregation in 1869. That's 4 years after the Civil War. It was a year after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments. And those were the amendments that guaranteed citizenship for formerly enslaved persons, which also meant they were able to not just purchase, but keep the land they purchased. Because before those amendments, they were not legally recognized as citizens. Therefore, anybody can come take their land, mostly the former white plantation owners and such. So they took that opportunity of those amendments in order to, with the knowledge that if they purchase the land, they can keep it and build a church on it. And that's why it was 1869. Very importantly, St. Paul was a part of what they call the Central Conference of the United Methodist Church. And what happened was that after the end of the Civil War, white missionaries of the Methodist Church came to the South and helped form groupings of African-American Methodists in the former Confederate States. And out of some of that grouping came formations like St. Paul United Methodist Church. As a matter of fact, the person who organized the Central Conference, I can't recall his name right now, was on his way. He's a Methodist. He was on his way to become the next president of the University of Alabama.
Wow.
He stopped on the way going to Tuscaloosa through Birmingham and other places, setting up these conversations with prospective Methodists who were formerly enslaved. Word got around. And when he got to Tuscaloosa, prank it could be, terror could be, he was hanged in effigy as a sign that we don't do that here and stuff. But nevertheless, the people who formed St. Paul built their congregation from there.
So we're 1869. We're talking about the first few preachers would have been formerly enslaved peoples. I know that Birmingham as a city was incorporated in 1871, and it became known as the Magic City. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of what made Birmingham a city and how St. Paul sort of coincided with the formation of Birmingham.
Yes. St. Paul as a congregation is 2 years older than the city of Birmingham. As a matter of fact, the valley in which Birmingham sits between two big ridges, north and south, was not even occupied at the time by indigenous peoples. All around this valley, there were indigenous Choctaw and other Native American groupings. But many different nations came to this valley for religious reasons, religious services. And a lot of historians think that, anthropologists even think that it's because the mineral ore that was here. So it had magnetic powers in the stones. It's iron ore and such. But nevertheless, when iron and limestone and coal were discovered in one place, it really attracted the industrialists of the north to come down south, and in order to produce steel, iron, and all of those iron-based, steel-based fabricated materials, and it was a rush. It was an iron rush to this valley, and by the industrialists. But they needed workers, and workers came from Europe, from Russia, from Greece, from Italy, and even New York City to come to Alabama and Birmingham to make their fortune. And of course, vendors came to the city to make their fortunes off of those folks, opening stores and markets and all kinds of trades, everything from tailoring to cobbling shoes or whatever and such. The workers themselves came from not just overseas in New York City, but formerly enslaved people from Alabama's Black Belt and poor whites from the hill country of North Alabama. All came together to make this city in the valley what could have been a city on a hill, a shining city on a hill. But the industrialists found out a way to prevent or hamper the growing unity between African Americans and whites by introducing racism on the job, different lines of seniority for same amount of work, paying African Americans less than they paid for whites, trying to create just enough dissension to prohibit them from uniting.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit some of the struggles that the early Black community in Birmingham faced. What were some of the missions that the early St. Paul congregation was involved in? What were some of their work in the early social justice movements in the Birmingham community?
Well, certainly, because so many of even the early beginnings of social services in large cities, and Birmingham was large for Alabama,
right,
were segregated. And continue to be up until even after the Civil Rights Movement. They were slow reforming, but such important things as health care, education. One of the things that have bound poor whites and poor African Americans together, even before 1900 during the populist movement, was free public education for white and Black children, for poor people, period. And they came up with a unique way of trying to fund it in that movement, and that was to tax the new high-tech industry of the day. At that time, it was railroads. That was bringing industry and goods to the South and also exporting them out of the South as well. But that movement crashed because the racism couldn't be overcome. But it did show the possibilities for unity between blacks and whites. But to respond to your question, education, operating schools, not formally incorporated schools, but teaching children in the churches. Of St. Paul was part of that movement. And healthcare. St. Paul was known to have doctors in particular who were able to provide free clinics to low-income people and in Birmingham. And St. Paul wasn't always at its present location. But at the locations it had up until, and including the present location, it was able to provide services. Because one thing for sure, being an African-American congregation, during the times of segregation, St. Paul was always in a poor neighborhood. Yeah.
What were some of the other locations that St. Paul worshipped in?
I know there was the last location before 1500 6th Avenue North was 8th Avenue North, about several blocks away. And that's now, there had been something built there, but that's now vacant lot. It's been long gone. The current location at 1500 6th Avenue North itself has its own story. when they built the church, it was designed by the same architect who designed 60th Street Baptist Church. But St. Paul just had one level built at that time. The late Reverend Joseph Eccles Lowry always referred to the time of St. Paul from 1925 to 1950 as being the time of y'all were in the basement for all those years. It wasn't the basement; it was the first floor. It was in 1950 they built the superstructure for the sanctuary. Yes.
You mentioned St. Paul's work in healthcare. I wanted to talk a little bit about Dr. Charles AJ Ferguson. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about his role in the church and his work with St. Paul.
Yes, Dr. McPherson was a leading member of the St. Paul United Methodist Church, well, St. Paul Methodist Church then. And as a physician, he was able to bring his skills to the community, not just the congregation. He even performed minor surgery at St. Paul. There's a photograph of him having removed a massive growth from someone in which this, I don't know if it was cancerous or not, but it definitely was a tumor. Was removed a person the size of I would say a softball. That's on display. But he was able to provide health care services to people in the community, and some from outside, in what we now call the administrative wing of St. Paul, which had the clinic on the first floor, and the pastor lived above the clinic. Yeah.
Is that in response to sort of some of the troubles that the Black community in Birmingham was facing at the time in healthcare?
Yes, it was. Like there are many troubles and barriers the African American community faced, but healthcare was one among many. To be Black in Birmingham or anywhere in Deep South at that time was learning to navigate barriers, and people who help the communities navigate those barriers were teachers, doctors, lawyers, even, and such. But Dr. McPherson was a community-minded person, period. Not just medically trained, he was community-oriented. For instance, he was also a member of the NAACP, which was an instrumentality created to help African Americans navigate those barriers and such. So it was part and parcel of his being to be able to bring his civic leadership and his healthcare leadership and converge them in and around St. Paul.
I was wondering, I know you mentioned the NAACP. Can you tell me a little bit about what the Birmingham branch of the NAACP looked like at the beginning and sort of how St. Paul played a role in helping it grow into the organization we know today?
In the early years of St. Paul, especially as the building its current location, the one before that one even, African American congregations were holders of hope, supporters of struggle, but they had to be strategic. They had to be wise. They had to hope for the best while preparing for the worst, and they had to raise their children in that environment. So there was often a lot when the NAACP was in Birmingham, it really grew in stature as a safe space in which to conduct political, civic, health-based, education-based activities. But at the same time, because of its stand for human rights, not just civil rights, in addition to civil rights, it grew a reputation among those who were even before George Wallace was saying segregation forever, as being an enemy of the state. And for that reason, its membership was kept quiet. And there were some members of the NAACP, including Dr. McPherson, who were secret members, so to speak, of the NAACP. But that kind of cover gets blown when you come out for important civic actions like freeing political prisoners. When you sign documents that are public. And the NAACP and Dr. McPherson were very much opposed to the proposed execution of the Scottsboro boys. at a very early stage, you know. And in the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, I have to say this, is that it attracted a lot of support from African Americans who saw through the thinly veiled lie that they had actually raped a young woman on a train near Fort Payne, Alabama, Scottsboro, actually. And they came to their defense at a time it was dangerous to do so. Mm-hmm. So to be known as an advocate of the freeing of the Scottsboro Boys at a time when the populace, white populace, was really riled up and it gained international attention, was a very dangerous person to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is also during the time, if I'm not mistaken, Jefferson County experienced one of the highest rates of racial violence lynchings in the country. Can you tell me a little bit more about how the Birmingham branch of the NAACP and how Dr. Charles AJ Ferguson, as the executive leader of that branch, sort of responded to these racial violence lynchings in the city of Birmingham?
Oh yes, they responded. They had marches downtown, small but heard. They definitely were interviewed a lot by the national black press, mm-hmm. including Jet Magazine and Evidence Magazine, the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore African American, and especially the Baltimore paper and the Pittsburgh paper. They were based in these cities, but they had national circulation. Mm-hmm. It was how news got from one part of the United States to the other, but about what was happening to African American communities all across the United States as well. The other part of it was these different trends and movements converged. There was a movement for segregation. No, there was an anti-lynching movement was before the desegregation movement. There was an anti-lynching movement had actually grown powerful in the South as well, addressing the widespread use of terror by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, and others. When there wasn't violence, there was a threat of violence. And the threat of violence itself is violence mm-hmm. as well. And so they played leadership roles in helping persons navigate the threats that came from just talking back to a police officer. They call it talking back. If you were, as people talk about, children had to be taught how to survive encounters with white people of the time, because there was this unnatural authority the white folks had over African Americans, or like not looking at white folks in the eye, mm-hmm. or saying yes sir or no sir, or yes ma'am, no ma'am. The people younger than you, being able to have to endure being called by your first name by a child, mm-hmm. a white child, and such. And things. So those were the things that people had to learn and to navigate back in those days, while still maintaining your full self-respect and your full dignity. Mm-hmm. It was necessary to survive in order to live to fight another day, so to speak. Yeah.
How did the Birmingham community and the St. Paul community navigate the reaction to the NAACP sort of being banned from the state of Alabama? What organization came in to replace the NAACP, and how was St. Paul a part of that?
Yes, NAACP had become notorious in the eyes of racists for standing up for desegregation of institutions, from buses to libraries. People talk about when things first got desegregated without talking about all the effort that went to it before it actually happened. Mm-hmm. And so those were decades-long struggles. Black libraries, white libraries, colored libraries, white libraries, segregated restaurants, blacks over here, whites over there, or blacks go around to the back. Nearly every facet, black seats on the bus in the back, white seats on the bus front. Every aspect of social and economic life was pierced by racist segregation. There was no escaping it at all. So in the 1950s, as word got around about 55, for instance, the Montgomery bus boycott was successful in Montgomery. Attempts were made here in Birmingham, but that didn't have the same impact, mm-hmm. effect that it had in Montgomery. The NAACP had become so well known to the authorities, especially law enforcement, mm-hmm. in Birmingham and Jefferson County in Alabama, that even the meetings were monitored. The mass meetings were monitored and were spied upon by agents of the state police for sure and such. But at one point, Dr. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth will later become a founder of Dr. King's organization as well. But what Fred Shuttlesworth was challenged with was providing the names of the members of the NAACP, and they refused to do that, and because that would be offering people up to possible death and death threats. But Fred had an inspiration, and he founded the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. It's noted that in this time, that as the heat was building up in the civil rights movement, the Fred had the foresight, Reverend Shuttlesworth had the foresight to call it the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And why was that so important? The world was swept up in the demand for human rights all around the globe. The United Nations had just been founded several years earlier. And one of the first things it came out with was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By calling it the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, Fred made the movement both faith-based and universal, in such a way that no one could deny the appeal by faith or the anti-fascist movement after World War II, the aspiration for democracy for people all around the globe. He saw it tied in a very interconnected way with the struggles for freedom all around the world, from Africa, from Johannesburg to Birmingham, as well as such. So that was a key founding moment in how it impacted St. Paul, and how it was Fred Shuttlesworth, remember, who invited Dr. King to Birmingham. Actually, he invited him twice before he actually came.
So what was sort of St. Paul's relationship to this movement, I should ask, in the late 50s, early 60s?
Yes, in the late 50s and early 60s, St. Paul members participated and were members of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. But also it became, as the 60s came into play, a place where, first of all, trainings happened around some of the early activities. For instance, around the marches to downtown for civil rights, the marches against Bull Connor, the marches against segregation, the marches against segregation and police brutality, the marches for dignity. Several different tactics were tried. For instance, the Easter boycott, financially depriving the store owners downtown of their money. You know, why dress up for racism under racist conditions, right? That stuff. So, and all those different strategies played a key role. St. Paul played a role, particularly not just being a source to launch some of the marches, like the Children's March in particular, but for several of the marches that had multi-church participation, from St. John AME to 60th Street Baptist Church to St. Paul Methodist Church. It was a training ground as well, where people learned the discipline of nonviolence, the dignity of nonviolence, and for those who could not and said they could not and knew they could not participate in a nonviolent way, they would ask you just stay in the church, you know, go out in church or something while we go. And so the idea was you can't fight violence with violence, and only love can defeat violence. And so St. Paul was in April of '63 was the site of the launch of the Children's March. This happened at a time when already children had marched, but fewer and fewer adults felt they were able to march at that time in the movement. And because they either been arrested before, if they got arrested again, it'd be a longer sentence, or their jobs could be threatened. There were more people taking photographs of the marchers, stuff to identify people and stuff.
Can you walk me through a little bit about that day, about the day of the Children's March, sort of what were the conditions leading up to it and what was the result?
The major conditions leading up to it was that, as I said earlier, was that so many people who were willing to be arrested, had been arrested, felt they couldn't be arrested anymore. Mm-hmm. Another part of the aspect of it was that, remember the goal of the marches wasn't just to march and confront Bull Connor. At one point, it said, well, Bull Connor is Bull Connor, but we got to change the system. It was to fill the jails, and by filling the jails, it was important that as many possible children attend. And as a matter of fact, instead of taking the jails were already full, so what did they use then? They used the state fairgrounds, several miles away. Mm-hmm. And so still the surviving marchers who were children at that time talk about the almost like it's almost as being somebody's birthday party. Now they talk about it with such glee of being in the same area of the fenced-in area at Fair Park as someone else they met there and such. And so proudful they were, and so honored they were to be there. And parents participated as well. Mm-hmm. One of our church members who still attends St. Paul, Laveria, talks about how her father was so proud of her being in the march and getting arrested, he didn't pick her up. And so finally her mother convinced him to go ahead and get our daughter. Things. But she still tells that story today. But the idea was to be able to go to jail with your best friend was one of the greatest honors that the children could have. There's another story about our sister church next door, 16th Street Baptist Church, where in Taylor Branch's book, Parting the Waters, the youth were so eager to go to jail that the young girl in front says, "Hurry up, Elizabeth. If you don't hurry up, you won't be able to go to jail with the rest of us." It's something you want to do with your best friend. And that was actually the spirit of the young people at the time, especially at St. Paul. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So looking back on St. Paul's, I guess, over 150-year history, what would you say that St. Paul's legacy is in the city of Birmingham?
I think St. Paul's legacy over all those years, from being advocates around healthcare and education, a great number of teachers attended St. Paul, or remember St. Paul over a span of time, was St. Paul, and I think still lasts to today, was always available to different stages of the movement as it progressed along. One of the things that's why we're known for the Children's Day March and participating in other marches as well, and for the health clinic for Dr. McPherson and for education classes for providing neighborhood children. We're also a site for a lot of different activities that gathered the movement, the civil rights movement, south-wide. Mm-hmm. In 1962, St. Paul was the host congregation, the host building of the site of the 1962 convening on, it says here, the Deep South and Ways and Means of Integration. Mm-hmm. And this was a conference put together by the Southern Conference Education Fund, the NAACP, and other organizations to bring attention to the best strategies and tactics for overcoming racism in the Deep South. As a matter of fact, St. Paul was the headquarters, and the other site was the A.G. Gaston Motel. Mm-hmm. For had workshops and such, and their topic was such thing as what's the best ways to use either economic boycotts or marches or communications even to defeat segregation in the Deep South. It was a thinking conference. Mm-hmm. It involved, I said, the NAACP, Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And SNCC. Mm-hmm. So it brought together the young and the old and the more progressive and some moderates in a common space. Mm-hmm. And it had at its keynote speaker a Dr. Schomer, who was one of the people who helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. and the recently founded, 10 years earlier, United Nations that came after World War II. Right.
Well, looking at the movement, it really seems like it was sort of a young people's movement. I guess reflecting back on St. Paul's history and its legacy in the city, what advice would you give to today's change makers? So what are the challenges they face, and what advice would you give them, if any?
I think we got to remember 1963. Dr. King was in Montgomery at 25. He was assassinated in 68 at 39. It was a young people's movement. It was more than a young people's movement. It was a children's movement. So the idea of I was thinking at the time of Dr. King and Fred Shuttlesworth being elders. I mean, they were younger than my parents. It really lets this generation know that how much counter pressure there can be, that all time is the right time to do right. In interpersonal, one-on-one relationships, and social justice issues in particular. Young people have to know, will come to know, but the sooner the better, will come to know that they are the formations of tomorrow right now. So you're already involved. The question is, you're already engaged. The question is, are you going to be positively engaged or just impacted? So those who feel the call for and need for a better, safer, more just world should get involved right now in any way that you can. One of the things that even with young folks, particularly, sometimes us older people, and that's every generation, don't give young people enough credit. We give young people credit for their creativity, their ingenuity, but not enough credit for their leadership. So I think we got to recognize, and young people recognize themselves, they do have the capacity to lead. And also remember, Dr. King saw leadership from the unsuspected places and spaces and people as very key to his own movement, the civil rights time. That's why he promoted some of the young people to it. Now, there was some young people who have disagreed with Dr. King about violence and nonviolence and those kind of things, about tactics, but they always respected Dr. King. And the point I'm trying to make is that creativity is part of leadership, but collaboration is another part of leadership. And Dr. King himself wrote a sermon called The Drum Major Instinct. In other words, the whole story is about you don't have to be in front to lead. You don't have to be the recognized leader to lead. To lead, what you really have to do is to listen to others, to listen to the moment, and listen to the movement, and begin to work with others in changing that moment for the better. That's true across generations. It's also true across generations. Some people want the limelight. Some people want the spotlight. Let them have the spotlight, but you get the trophy for winning victories that actually benefit people's lives.
I like what you said, all the time is the right time to do the right thing. But thank you, Mr. Douglas, for sitting down with me today to talk about the generations of change makers for St. Paul United Methodist Church. I appreciate our conversation today.
Well, thank you very much, Brucey. Thank you.
I know in my work as a historian, it is often difficult to find voices of hope and perseverance in the Black community, as Black voices have so often been left out of the historical archive. This is why it's been so important to do the work now to preserve Black histories, and I'm very thankful for Mr. Douglas to be here today to provide a testament to the history of St. Paul. So thank you, Mr. Douglas, for letting us in on the generations of change makers of the St. Paul community and for continuing on the legacy of being a change maker today.
Well, thank you, Brucey. We thank you for remaining stayed on freedom and helping us in this journey as we move forward. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of Stayed on Freedom, a podcast of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. And until next time, join with us in remaining stayed on freedom.